The shield grid was dark before my shuttle even touched the landing platform, and that single fact told me everything was wrong. My name is Vesa, and I am the queen of my hive. I had been away for 11 days on a diplomatic journey across 3 star systems, and I was expecting a quiet return. Instead, the moment my ship dropped out of transit, I smelled smoke through the air vents, and my private beacon, the one every child of my hive learns to feel like a heartbeat, had gone completely silent. I did not wait for my guards to form their usual line behind me. I ran straight into the tower alone, and I did not care how reckless that was. The lower halls were stained and torn, and there were far fewer bodies on the ground than there should have been, which meant only one thing: someone had dragged the missing ones away. I knew this pattern. Raiders from the rival hive of Corvain had done this before, and they always came for one reason. They wanted the eggs. They wanted my children. I climbed flight after flight without stopping, and I do not remember most of that climb. I only remember what I found at the top. The door to the nursery wing was burned black, around a hole large enough for a grown man to crawl through, and standing in front of that hole, wedged into the broken frame with a metal rod in one hand and his other arm hanging at a strange angle, was a human named Daniel. Daniel had come to my hive 6 years earlier as part of a peace agreement between our people and his. He had been given to my household as a helper, mostly assigned to small duties around the nursery wing. I had never asked him much about himself. I had never really looked at him at all. He was simply part of the household, like a piece of furniture that happened to walk and speak. But now, he was the only thing standing between my children and the raiders trying to break through. I expected to feel sadness for him, the kind you feel for someone about to be lost. Instead, I felt something closer to shock, because he was not just standing there in fear. He was working. He had pushed furniture from inside the nursery to block the gap, and he was using the doorway itself as a weapon. Every time a raider tried to force its way through, he did not meet it with strength, because he had none that could match theirs. He met it with timing. He caught their limbs in the narrow frame and twisted, using their own force against them. He had also spread cooling fluid from a broken pipe across the floor, so their footing slipped the moment they tried to charge forward. 3 raiders were already down in that hallway, not because of his strength, but because of his mind, and because of that, the door behind him had not opened. My children were still crying inside, which meant they were still alive. Daniel did not turn to look at me right away. He kept his eyes on the gap in the door and said, calmly, "My queen, I could use some help now." In 6 years, he had never spoken to me without the formal greeting. First, I had assumed that was simply how his voice worked, flat and careful, shaped by training. I understood in that moment how wrong I had been. I stepped beside him, not past him, because some instinct told me that pushing past him would be an insult he had not earned. My natural weapons are not gentle. My forearms carry blades built for defense, and until that day, I had never once used them outside of ceremony. We fought from that same narrow space for what felt like a long stretch of time, though later it was recorded as only a few minutes. It felt like we were learning, without a single word between us, how to move so that we would not get in each other's way. When the last of the raiders finally pulled back and fled, rather than continue facing a queen who had clearly stopped being calm, Daniel did not celebrate. He turned straight to the barricade and called out to my youngest child by name through the gap. He kept speaking gently, telling her that everything was safe now, that she could stop being afraid, until my guards finally broke through from the other side and reached the children. Only then did Daniel sit down against the wall, holding his injured arm carefully, breathing hard. I had many questions. I always have questions, and my mother used to say that was one of my greatest flaws. But before anything else came out of me, it was an order, sharp enough that even my own guards flinched. Someone set his arm properly right now, and someone find out how a helper assigned to nursery duties learned to fight like a trained soldier, because I want to understand why I never knew this before. Daniel, pale from pain, but somehow almost smiling, gave a tired laugh. I was never hiding it, my queen. Nobody ever asked. That single sentence stayed with me longer than the smoke in the halls, longer than the sight of the broken door, even longer than my children's crying, which faded within the hour into peaceful sleep. Nobody ever asked. 6 years in my household, and I had never once wondered what he was capable of. I had simply placed him in a category and stopped thinking about it. I sat beside him while the healer worked his shoulder back into place, which is not something a queen is expected to do, and several of my advisors later suggested, carefully, that I should not make a habit of it. I told them I would think about their advice exactly as much as I planned to, which was not at all. Later that night, after the nursery had been cleared and the broken door repaired, I asked Daniel to walk with me through the upper garden. The stars were clear, and the noise of the day had finally settled into a calm kind of silence. I asked him why he had stayed at the door instead of running when the shields failed. He said it was simple. The children could not run, and someone had to stand in the way, and he happened to be the one already there. He said it the way someone might explain why they picked up a fallen object, as if there had never been another choice to consider. I asked him where he had learned to fight the way he had, using timing and traps instead of raw strength. He told me that where he came from, humans were often smaller and weaker than the creatures around them, so they learned early to use their surroundings instead of their muscles. He said his people had a saying, that a clever trap is worth more than a strong arm, and he had simply grown up practicing that idea in small ways, never expecting to use it the way he had that day. I found myself watching him differently as he spoke, not as a servant, and not as a piece of household furniture, but as someone with an entire history I had never bothered to ask about. The following morning, I called a meeting with my council. I told them that starting that day, every human serving in my household would be given the chance to train alongside my own guards if they wished, and that their skills, however unusual they seemed, would be taken seriously rather than ignored. Some of my advisors were surprised. A few were even uneasy, but none of them argued, not after what had happened in the nursery hallway. Daniel remained close to the nursery wing after that, though his role changed. He was no longer simply a helper assigned small duties. He became someone my children looked forward to seeing, someone who taught them small games using patience and cleverness rather than brute force, the same kind of thinking that had saved their lives. Weeks passed, and the tower slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The shield grid was repaired and strengthened, and new measures were put in place to prevent another surprise like the one that had almost taken everything from me. But even as life returned to its usual pace, I found I could not fully return to how I used to think. I had spent years assuming that strength alone defined worth, that my own hive's abilities were simply superior, and that others existed mainly to serve within that structure. Daniel had shown me, in the space of a few tense minutes, that worth was not something measured only by claws or blades. It was measured by what someone chose to do when everything depended on them, especially when no one was watching and no reward was promised. I came home that day, expecting only to learn what I had lost. Instead, I learned what I had never taken the time to notice in the first place, and I understood clearly that I did not intend to make that same mistake again. From that point forward, whenever new arrivals came to serve within my household, I made it a rule to ask more questions, to look closer, and to never again assume I already understood someone, simply because of where they came from or what role they had been given. And every time I passed the repaired door to the nursery wing, I remembered the quiet man who had stood there alone, holding back more than just raiders, and reminding me, without meaning to, of a lesson I would carry for the rest of my reign.